Good afternoon and welcome to Cold Chain Insights, the podcast that focuses everything temperature-controlled logistics for the pharmaceutical industry. My name's Thomas Hunt, and this week I'm delighted to be joined by Kevin Hickman, who was formerly Director of Global Logistics at Mirati Therapeutics, which is a BMS company. Kevin, welcome to the podcast. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today.
Great. It's good to have you on all the way over from the US. I think a good place to start maybe is if you talk us through your career so far and the sort of companies you work with and the types of roles that you've done.
So I've been in pharmaceuticals and biopharmaceuticals for over 20 years, really 30 years at this point, and 25 plus of that has been in having responsibility for temperature control in some form from the early days when it was very basic insulated shipper with some gel packs to today's world of active, passive, hybrid solutions that are all over from different sizes. And I've done international as well as domestic shipping and all sizes too, from small domestic FedEx parcel shipments to large containers, sea container, air container type shipments of bulk material, bulk finished goods all over the globe.
Nice, great. Okay, thanks for that. And I think I want to start with you led Mirati's global logistics function during the BMS acquisition, Bristol Myers Squibb. What part of that transition required the most hands-on intervention from you personally, and how was that experience?
Overall, the experience went pretty smoothly. It was just a matter of getting the BMS people up to speed on how we did things and how the vendors kind of what their expectations were as far as either documents or processes or communication. Obviously, Mirati being a much smaller company, our processes were more hands-on, more manual, and BMS's was very heavy in the sense of letting the vendors own more of the responsibilities and then just checks and balances, that kind of thing. So it was really just sitting down with them. And I would say the biggest challenge was that there was, whereas again, Mirati being a small company, I had my hands in everything. BMS being a global company like they were, they had different people for each segment, each material or product that was in process, either commercial or clinical. So I was talking to different people for every aspect of my role, and that included warehousing and 3PL storage, as well as just manufacturing, logistics, moving products throughout the manufacturing process and get the packaging and labeling up to the commercial 3PL distribution center. So it was I guess an extended process. I was there about a year during the transition, but it worked well. And by the end there, they had it, and I was just there to put out fires or answer questions if they came up.
Yeah, nice. Okay. And during that period, if you sort of look back, what was one of the toughest decisions you had to make while maintaining full responsibility for the logistics sector during that acquisition? Because you were sort of, I presume, having to cover both areas.
Yeah, I would say the hardest was actually when trying to figure out exactly when somebody took over full responsibility, that transition, because it did, like I said, I was working with different people who had different workloads and schedules and that sort of thing. So it was a lot of, am I the primary and they're the backup? And when do we transition, and coordinating with them to make sure that we weren't really either duplicating efforts or, more importantly, missing some kind of communication with a vendor or 3PL or a transit company, just by assuming. So I think the biggest thing was I didn't want to assume anything. So if anything, I might have over communicated a lot, but it was more just to make sure we were not missing anything and not missing a scheduled production run, that sort of thing.
Yeah. Okay. And I know one of your early roles was at Gilead, and you managed distribution of CRT 228 frozen, I think cryogenic and some other ranges that you can explain. And which of those
Yeah.
consistently caused the highest operational risk in your experience?
Honestly, I've always said this throughout my career. CRT tends to be the most challenging, just in the sense of a temperature profile. But as far as with Gilead goes, the LN2 shipments were kind of challenging and really critical. I think the biggest problem there was whenever you needed to move a vial of cells from point A to point B, the timing had to be just right, in the sense of they had a scheduled thaw and production run sitting there waiting. And if we couldn't get an LN2 shipper to our warehouse to put it in there and get it transported out to wherever it needed to be in a timely manner, that delayed the whole production run by a day or two. And there were times this was happening when the business was starting to really pick up. Cell and gene therapies were the hot item at the time. So the carriers were struggling a bit to try and meet the demand or the requested pickup dates primarily. The delivery, once it was picked up, it moved fine. There wasn't that many problems except for the occasional LN2 can be tricky if in some shippers with orientation, i.e. they can't lay on their side. And most of the couriers know that, but every once in a while an airline employee doesn't. You've got a mess or a lost shipment kind of thing. So yeah, it was really just more timing and then
Mhm.
dealing with those one-offs, human errors really more than anything. The systems themselves worked. It was just always like any system. You try and make it as simple as possible, but occasionally something happens and now you got to deal with it. That's why people like me exist to deal with those situations.
Yeah, for sure. And so why was CRT, or why, in your experience, why was that one of the harder ones to manage? What was it about that?
In terms of that, it's usually, and again, a lot of my CRT tends to be bulk shipments, so
Mhm.
finished goods, which have higher stability, but that still doesn't mean that when we have an excursion, we just ignore it, so to speak. The companies I've always worked with have always had a tighter risk profile, I guess, that we didn't lean on stability data automatically. I have been with some companies that was just like, if it's within this time frame and this range, it's all good, let it go. And other ones, it was like, nope, you've got to open a investigation on each and every one, even if it was technically, I've done ones that it was above 30C for 5 minutes. Well, that's still an excursion. You got to look into it, even though I knew it was fine. It's just a matter of the external temperature conditions and the just trying to keep them within that 15 to 30 or 15 to 25 range. 2 to 8 is, in my experience, has always been a little bit easier
Mhm.
just because there's so much more. I guess you could say it's the oldest temperature range that we used to manage. That was the first one was, like vaccines and everything. Flu vaccine is 2 to 8, and that is a bit touchy if it gets below 2, or especially below 0.
Mm.
But yeah, the CRT was always something that was just a little more, we'd have more random excursions just because of delays on the tarmac, or if it was a truckload or a sea container, maybe it was, just something going through Arizona or some other hot environment that affected a section of the load. And primarily too, with big loads, there were multiple loggers
Right.
on a lot of these shipments. So if one went out, you had to deal with the whole situation, the whole load, trying to sort it out.
Yeah. And so, what do you think the industry still relies on too heavily then, on sort of unstable or high risk lanes?
Well, if it's unstable or high risk, you tend to go more active, which of course is more expensive. And usually that's I would say that's earlier in the process, like clinical, just because you don't have a lot of stability data. It
Mhm.
tends to be belt and suspenders kind of approach. You want to have all the coverage you can, and then once you get that history, that proven history, if it's a consistent shipping lane and you show that you have it under control, then you can back it off and go to passive, or even something as simple as a pallet blanket or something like
Mm.
thermal blanket like that to maintain spikes. But otherwise, again, you lean on the drugs stability data to kind of keep it moving through the system. But again, it's that really depends on the company's approach to it. I've worked for companies that have been super conservative, like I said, and then other ones that were a little bit more where I did have some of the leeway of making an initial assessment and then documenting that assessment, and that then it was covered, and then I would just get, obviously audited occasionally, and somebody would look at what we did. But in general, it's not rocket science. You get a time limit and a temperature range, and if it's within those parameters, all right, it's fine.
Yeah. Yeah, 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 for sure. Okay. And obviously, over those years you've worked in the industry and in the roles you've worked, that relying on your sort of your partners is always really important, and the vendors that you work with across the sector. What's the sort of over those partnerships and over those times, what's the biggest lessons you've learned in terms of handling vendor relationships and the best practice?
I mean, in general, in today's world, the vendors know what they're doing. They've been doing it for a long time. They've been very innovative in things. So you still need to, it's a trust but verify situation. But for a lot of the vendors that I use, and they're usually ones that I have a lot of experience with, I've used over the years, 10, 20 years. So I can build that trust. But again, you've got to have when you qualify them as a vendor with your company, and then write up either your shipping lane protocols or your SOPs on how to handle things, just making sure that they're following it. But again, the data is there. In general, I tend to actively monitor the majority of my shipments. I know some companies actually don't, but that's fine. That's again, they have data to back that up. So it always is. I'm kind of keeping an eye on it, and just open communication, regular business reviews, and then knowing who to talk to and ask the right questions too, I guess, with the sense of when something does go wrong. Again, I've been doing this. I've done enough investigations over the years that I know what to ask them to even kind of maybe point them in a certain direction to look at that and see what's going on. Because I have seen some interesting excursions over my career. But like you said, you learn lessons from that and take precautions to avoid that situation again.
Yeah, is any of those that you could share as the one that stood out in your mind and you thought, "Well, that was really unexpected and it came slightly left
Yeah,
field"?
it was not a not a great one, but it was a shipment going to Asia, air container. And when we qualified the lane, we made sure we asked the question and documented and everything that they had a refrigerated storage at the airport in case it gets delayed with customs or anything like that, where it can't be moved to the final warehouse, that kind of thing. So yay, they've got a warehouse. Shipment comes in. I think it was like 20 pallets or something like that. The problem was the question we never asked was what was their average capacity level of that cold room? In other words, that shipment that I'm talking about came in, the cold room was full. Basically, the dock worker, warehouse guy thought more cold is better and put it in the freezer. But unfortunately, this particular product, it couldn't be frozen. So it was trash. And then to make it worse, not all, I think it was like 18 pallets, not all 18 pallets got put in the freezer. Some of them were put in the freezer, some were put in the cold room. But this was back in the day when you had to wait for the temperature data to get back to you. So what had happened was once it cleared, once it made delivery, we finally got the temperature data back and found out that some of the pallets were in frozen, some were in the proper's 2 to 8, but they didn't document which pallets. So even though I think it was 4 or 5 pallets were frozen, we had to throw the whole lot away because we couldn't tell which were frozen and which were refrigerated. And so it was the lesson was dig that next step of detail, dig into it and find out what is your average capacity. Can you handle 20 pallets on a normal turn and that sort of thing? And then more importantly, if the cold room or whatever the situation is, if this happens, do this. And in other words, if they just left it on the dock, it would have been fine. It actually had stability data at controlled room temp or regular temp. It was the frozen that was a light bulb moment.
So often human error causes these situations, and that really is the one that comes up time and time again.
Yeah, the person tried, nice try, but no, they would have, and I stressed with a lot of my vendors, if something happens, let me know, because then the onus is on me to make the key decisions that maybe you're not aware of, and you're not making the bad decision like that. Not that I want calls at all hours of the day, but at the same time, if they'd let me know, I could have salvaged that shit.
Yeah, for sure. Okay. You've managed both commercial and clinical logistics, which is really interesting. Which side is hardest to handle and why?
Commercial's more steady. Obviously, there's more, well, I wouldn't say more, but there's a different kind of pressure to just meet the time demands and everything, especially a lot of times if you're short on inventory, you need to get something from A to B to the 3PL so they can then get it further down the supply chain. But it is pretty much, if you will, a churn and burn most of the time. There's not a lot of variability to it. Where clinical, there's a lot more variances. Again, there's usually not a lot of stability data on a lot of the materials, so everybody's going above and beyond what needs to be done. So it's not just a matter of being more nimble and addressing an issue or a challenge or a request that comes up to ship to maybe a new country that you haven't done before, or trying to get a comparable product somewhere that might be out of my normal, catalog materials or familiarity that we're dealing with. And then just as a side note, the R&D are exceptionally challenging just because there are these random and usually late requests in terms of trying to get something shipped from point A to point B at a moment's notice. And then the other challenge with the clinical is, again, everybody goes kind of above and beyond. Then it's trying to prove that we don't need to be spending this kind of money and effort with all these, active, really secure processes. Once we do a few shipments, let's try and convince the quality group, the owners of the program managers and that sort of thing, the scientists, you know what? it's pretty good. We've got things under control. Can we back it off and maybe go to a passive pallet shipper or something like that instead of all this active bells and whistles kind of things? And so
Yeah.
it's just a matter of, because ultimately what I'm doing in the clinical world, I translate over to the commercial world initially upon launch. You're more or less, it's a proven process. Nobody wants to mess with that, especially at a commercial launch. So you tend to do that too. And then now you're dealing with same thing. You just got to do assessments and again, trying to do what's the most efficient, cost effective, but keeping that quality. Quality is always the primary focus. And I always argue spending a couple $1,000s more on a shipment to save $1 million worth of product is kind of a no brainer to me. I mean, I want to save money. I want to be efficient, but at the same time, I don't want to be being asked the question, why didn't we spend $2,000 more? And now we got our $2 million write off.
Yeah. Or dealing with the cost of quarantine pallets or everything else that comes with it, the sort of ancillary costs of something just even being delayed or just put into quarantine to check around
Yeah.
stability data. I mean, all costs money, doesn't it, at the end of the day?
And the other challenge, going back to the vendor management, is if there is an issue, sometimes it's a challenge to stop it, if you will. If you don't have controls, in other words, if you don't have the vendor understand that until we say it's good, you can't continue it down the manufacturer. Worst case possible is you find out there was, in my world, a temperature excursion and they moved it onto the manufacturing floor. Now we've got a whole different and deeper problem to deal with and a bigger deviation that we have to deal with. So, and potentially again, if it's lost material and we've now processed it, we've wasted all that money as well in the manufacturing side of things. So it's just a matter of making sure the vendors aren't too gung-ho, so to speak, in terms of trying to get things processed as soon as it comes in the door.
Who specifies new, for example, packaging or monitoring solutions in a lane that you've worked on? Is it the vendor? Is it the 3PL would come to you and you would approve it, or would you do that yourself?
I've had both. I've done some that I've just approached vendors and said, hey, is there anything new we can do? A good example would be in the simple world of commercial US distribution, small parcel. I've gone through numerous generations of shippers just to say if they have something better or I have a problem with the one that we're currently using, they might offer it a better solution than going through the qualifications and inductions and then introducing it through to the 3PL. One of the bigger challenges there is always kind of if you own the shippers, burning through your existing inventory and then managing that switch to the new inventory at the right time. But I've had vendors approach me with, hey, we've got this new system. It's really cool. It'll save you money. Okay, cool. Let's look at it and do that. But I've also had some that it's like, hey, your boxes are being phased out. You've got 2 years to find another solution. And I've had to deal with that too. So it's really usually me and my team that initiates it. The vendors might approach me, but I've just as often approached them and said, hey, is there something better? Or I see you guys have something new in your catalog. Can we explore that? That kind of thing.
Yeah. Okay. It's sort of across your global experience, taking out sort of current situation like conflicts around the world and wars, etc. In general, in your experience, which regions are the hardest to build reliable cold chain performance in on a sort of yearly basis, and why? Which were the most challenging lanes you've always found came up?
If you had asked me that question 15 years ago, I would have easily said Latin America was the
Right.
least mature of the markets. Parts of Asia too, obviously. And then I don't do much, but from my understanding, the African continent is still a little bit challenging. Everything is better. They're light
Mm.
years better than what it was 20 years ago. It used to just be North America and Europe. That was the if you will, the gold standards, and everything else was you kept a closer eye on. I would trust shipments between Germany and the U.S. that I did a lot just because we've done it a million times, and both areas have well-established processes and protocols and that sort of thing. Where Latin America, or Asia, some parts of Asia, they were still learning, so to speak. But at this point, the cold chain has been around for 20 plus years, 30 plus years on a global scale, and vendors are good at it and companies are better at it. In fact, if anything, some countries might be more rigid or whatever, if you will, in their requirements, and then you're up in the game, so to speak. And I get it. Again, they know their country better than I might know. So it's just a matter of if they feel that's necessary, I have to adapt to it and address it, whatever that situation may be.
Yeah. Okay. And just picking on something you said earlier, I mean, you've driven cost reduction and efficiency programs in the roles that you've done. And which cost saving initiative delivered the biggest impact without compromising quality, in your experience?
I would say the biggest ones were, this is going back a while, but in commercial distribution, I did make a switch from an early generation cold chain shipper, qualified cold chain shipper with vacuum insulation.
Hmm.
But the thing was a beast. It was a tub. It was basically like a fiberglass tub with the vacuum insulation. And so I always joked you could put balance a tank on this thing. So it was heavy, it was bulky, it took a lot of storage, that kind of thing. In fact, because of that robustness, we approached the vendor at that point about looking into doing a reverse logistics and reusing those shippers instead of just landfilling them. So I worked with the vendor to set that up. But anyway, we one, that reverse logistics saved us a ton of money.
Hmm.
Then we went to another generation of their shipper that was lighter, bigger payload, still same reverse logistics, saved a lot more money. And then on a global scale, same company there, and also with Mirati, we did some changes from active to passive shipping kind of thing that saved us a lot of money. And I mentioned before, sea shipping, that was a huge cost saver as well. And on top of it, it was a time saver in the sense of once we got the company and all the parties within the company comfortable with it, we would ship the batch of finished goods, say to Asia or Latin America or wherever it was going under quarantine, and
Hmm.
then let the lot approval process happen while it was on the ocean. And so by the time it arrived, it was usually released. I'd say 99% of the time. Of course, there was always one-offs, and then sea freight is obviously a much cheaper option versus air freight. But I more recently run into a lot of people being nervous about sea freight because for lack of a better term, they see on Instagram or something the pictures of the stack of containers falling off a ship in the middle of the Pacific in a storm. And it's like, well, we can't have that. And it's like, well, yeah, but what's the percentage of? And on top of it, usually our containers are more lower on the stack because if the
Yeah.
mechanics fail on the compressor or something, they have to be. So my argument was always, unless the ship sinks, you're probably okay. But can it happen? Absolutely. But a truck could wipe out. I've had a truck accident to deal with in my life. Airlines have problems, stuff
Yeah. Yeah.
happens when you get out in the real world that I think a lot of people, and especially, when their mindset is more like a manufacturing or a lab where it's all self-contained, and then understanding that I can't control every variable out in the real world. I can just mitigate risk.
Mm.
It takes some time to convince people to get a little more comfortable with that, especially when you're dealing with some folks on the clinical side, like one of the head scientists. This is their baby, and the last thing they want to see is their baby get hurt somewhere in transit.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
you gotta take that into
So is
account
it, is it,
too.
is it constant sort of wrestle or battle around the sort of over engineering the entire lane as you sort of described earlier and the cost and complexities around that versus saying, guys, look, we don't need to spend this much money on this. We can make it perfectly safe, but we have to take a slightly sort of higher risk profile if something dramatically goes wrong. It's always that trade-off, I
Yeah,
suppose.
I can sit there and talk about costs all I want, but ultimately it's my budget that gets impacted, not theirs.
Yeah, yeah.
So I have had that conversation too.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I think on reefers and on sea containers, I haven't heard actually people worried about it falling off. But obviously, I'm not as close to some of the internal conversations. But I think that the
Yeah,
unplug at the port or the unplug of the reefer over the last few years, but obviously everyone's gone from air to ocean where they can to reduce costs, and obviously in general it's very secure. When the reefers are unplugged in these ports, there's quite a high risk there of, we've seen temperatures of say a 25-degree outside temperature, and that reef will go from 4 degrees to 12 reasonably quickly, in 3 or 4 hours. And a lot of unplugs
yeah.
are 6 hours, etc. So it's an odd one in that part of the supply chain, the reefers, because the perception is they're so solid, but they're actually not in some.
Yeah. It's there again, that's the variable I was talking about. There is absolutely risks in that, in anywhere, in handling things. Same thing with air shipments. You've got guys who are handling air freight, and yes, they might be trained on the pharmaceutical side, but I've seen some weird, they just leave it out overnight. I had a shipment one time transit in Alaska. I forget why it was going that way, but anyway, in the middle of December, and they left it on the tarmac overnight. Cool. Thanks, guys, kind of thing. So again, you can build all these bells and whistles and processes and communication lanes and that sort of thing, but ultimately stuff happens and people make it. They're not doing it intentionally. Everybody makes a mistake. I've made mistakes. I've damaged product. I've worked in warehouses and run a forklift through a pallet occasionally. So it happens.
Yeah, for sure. And you've worked obviously in active, passive, small parcel, pallets, sea containers, etc. Out of in your experience, and if you're looking at a new lane, where do you sort of feel you intrinsically go to in terms of a model or a pack out that you trust the most, and where are you kind of most wary over the years?
Initially, never done sea freight as an initial. It's always been air if it's
Right.
overseas, and it's usually with like the Envirotainers or Sea Safes of the world. It depends on the product and the how risky it is in terms of stability and that sort of thing if we go passive or active, but I'm almost always doing air freight for bulk shipments overseas and even small parcel shipments. Sea freight is usually that, okay, we've got this kind of under control. We've got stability data. We can go to sea freight and use the same process that we've used for other drugs to go into this and just maybe slightly modify it or something like that to make sure that you've got that coverage and that risk aversion as much as possible.
Okay. And then across your entire cold chain career, what's the single insight you wish you could teach every sponsor before they design their first global lane, or maybe the first lane on a new product? What would you advise on that?
They've had a couple instances where they had temperature ranges outside the standards. So a good example was a product years ago that it was 2 to 6. And we had actually, in that case, we had bought it and bought the company and bought the product. And then
Mm,
they were like, we need to launch this and induct it into ours. I'm like, that's cool. I have no way to support that temperature range. I warehouse through transport, I need to do something about it. So they luckily were able to change the labeled conditions eventually, but something like that. And then just wonky, other temperature ranges that are just outside the norm. And then honestly, the packaging can get a little cute to where the point is it's difficult to find a box that, especially on the domestic small parcel side or any small parcel shipment, I should say, where it fits. The bottle is too bulky. The packaging, it might be a bottle in a carton inside another carton. And sometimes that outer carton has space in it. They haven't picked a custom box to fit it perfectly. So you may have like say 9 bottles in there, but there's that much gap in it. That's a
mhm,
risk for damage just because the material is going to shift in there, that kind of thing. So it is that too of just, don't get cute with the packaging.
mhm, mhm,
And another lesson, this goes more from cold chain to warehousing and 3PL, but I had one product where the packaging they introduced, the coloring on the carton, the unit carton, essentially made the QR code for the pedigree, the serialization, useless. The readers couldn't read it. It was, I think, orange on kind of an orange background, and the reader being read failed a huge amount of times when you were trying to scan it with a
yeah,
regular handheld scanner. And this is going back maybe 10 years now, but it's just one of those things of like, hey, maybe we should have checked that first
yeah, yeah,
before
yeah,
we
yeah.
get down to this point. So again, you talk about lessons learned. That's the kind of thing that now, if I'm ever involved in, it's just like, hey, what's the carton look like? So I know the warehouse can handle it when it comes down to it.
Yeah, nice. Yeah, for sure. And I wanted to get on to active versus passive shipping before we finish, because I know you've written about this. And I think my real question is, can you just talk us through what it is that you were describing in that piece, and your views on them? Because I think you've obviously done some work on it.
Yeah, I mean, I've kind of mentioned it a couple times here, but active tends to be the one that is used when you either don't have stability or it's a high value item, something that's just got more perceived risk, either financial or quality wise. And so active gives you that more flexibility. Or again, mentioned the oddball temperature range. Well, active, you can set those a lot of times to that kind of a unique temperature profile, and but they cost a lot more and there's risks still involved. Some people think that active is kind of a no problem solution, but like you mentioned with the sea freight containers, the battery charge is running down on a pallet shipper or something like that, and you need to find some place to plug it in. That's a
Mhm,
arrangement. And then passive obviously is cheaper. It's more prone to human error, probably
mhm,
primarily because of the packouts designs. Everybody's got a different design. Companies get a little cute with their PCMs and need you to also do some preconditioning, i.e., take a frozen pack out of the freezer and then let it sit at room temperature for 30 minutes. Well, that's a hard warehouse process to manage and keep the problem I would always have is quality would say is how will you show me that was thawed or that was preconditioned for 30 minutes kind of thing and setting up that process. So, and then just the operator, especially when you're more and more in today's world, it's 3PLs that the warehouse might have 30 different customers. And if they're using 30 different boxes, that's a lot for that operator to try and keep in mind. Even if they have a diagram, a lot of them will put the diagram on the box or have it somewhere near their station. But again, you could easily mix a frozen and refrigerated, and that could be the make or break of that drug makes it in time or makes it under the right conditions, I should say.
Yeah, I think the sort of preconditioning element of passive is quite hard, isn't it? I think I've spoken to a lot of customers around to precondition PCM and then bring it in or manage that process, and to do that at scale is quite hard. So it's managing that. And as you say, active should be really very secure, but there are weak spots with it and it's costly. And I think people are becoming far more sensitive to costs now post COVID,
Yeah,
where there wasn't so
definitely.
much concern. So it's probably becoming more.
That is absolutely correct. And the other thing with COVID was, I guess a lot of people left cold chain. They just pretended it's too complicated. I don't want to be involved. And then suddenly COVID, everybody was a cold chain expert. So they have their opinions and
Yeah.
thoughts and how. And I'm usually, what's the temperature and for how long? Let me figure out what we're going to do here, and I'll let you
Yeah.
know.
Yeah, exactly. And pulling in the vendor and pulling in the 3PL and everyone being involved with just to figure out that problem is quite helpful sometimes as well.
You bring up a good point that's one thing is getting all the parties involved. Now that can be a negative in the sense of too many cooks in the kitchen kind of thing, but in general, I don't want to do anything in a vacuum and somebody come in and go, why'd you do that? And I don't like that or whatever the case may be. So there is
Yeah.
a constant communication, even in just the choice and induction process. Usually it's just, I'm going to do this. Here's its benefits. Okay. But every once in a while, somebody has a question.
And I think the packaging vendor can look at their spec and say, okay, I can probably reduce I can reduce the PCM loading and reduce cost, or I could swap a VIP panel out for a piece of standard insulation and reduce your cost or give you more payload. So if you're working around the sort of, some boxes obviously have 120 hours, but you might only require 70 or 60 or 50, I don't know. So just working on that just to get your cost element out and other parts. And then obviously your 3PL can be hugely helpful to look at, I suppose, things like tarmac time and say, okay, realistically, what's the average tarmac time I'm going to get in that airport, and sort of bringing that together, isn't it? So I don't know. I just feel there's a lot of collaboration there that probably quite helpful. But when you're trying to figure
Absolutely,
these things out.
absolutely. And that data is, like you said, very important to help you make that analysis and decision.
Yeah. Okay. What's the one shift you're sure will reshape cold chain logistics in the next 5 years? What do you think will happen over the coming years, and where we might end up?
I mean, obviously, real-time data, and that is the big thing, has been for a couple of years. And now with AI, I think there's going to be the ability to be a little more predictive and actually maybe look at some of the factors, i.e. weather or flight delays somewhere. Like you mentioned, what's going on in the Middle East, that's causing a lot of disruption for transatlantic or global shipments that transited through the Middle East, like Dubai or something like that. The AI tools might be able to help you say, well, you shouldn't go this route today because there's a storm coming or there's flight disruptions or whatever, and be better at that than, as you said, getting something sitting at an airport for an extra day or two. And then if something is happening with that real-time data, being able to react before you get an excursion, get set parameters to say when it gets to, say, for 7 degrees C, hey, let's do this to try and, get it in a cold room or get it re-iced if it's a passive shipper, if you can do that. Opening a box, obviously, quality is not a big fan of that as far as something in transit. So you have to have those processes. But I think that's the biggest thing, is just that real-time data coupled with predictive analytics to make sure that you're not throwing something into a situation that's going to put that shipment at risk.
Yeah, good. Okay, well, I know we're pretty much out of time, but I want to thank you for coming on, Kevin. It was a brilliant conversation, and we covered a huge amount there. So I really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you again for the opportunity.
Good. Okay, so you've been listening to Cold Chain Insights. My name's Thomas Hunt. Please tune in next week for our next episode, and we look forward to seeing you then. Thank you.